I am an immigrant to the United States. In fact, I just became a US citizen last year. And this year, 2024, will be the first time that I can vote in a national US election. And this is particularly important because this year, immigration is a top concern for US voters. As a political scientist, an international relations scholar, and someone who has dedicated most of their career to studying human security, I have become more and more interested in how we talk about immigration, particularly immigrants from the southern border. Now, I'm a Canadian immigrant, and there really is no heated debate about Canadians surging from the northern border and entering into the United States, as far as I'm aware. But as an immigrant, I have experienced the kind of anti-immigrant comments that many do when they enter the new environment, the host country. I've also had to deal with the scary and invasive questions that were asked anytime we cross in and out of the United States. In addition, I've had to deal with the fear and sense of being an outsider to my new host country. But my experience is very limited. Many people who are migrating, particularly from the southern border, have had much more severe and significant experiences, dangerous ones that are trauma-laden as well. And I feel a real sense of responsibility to represent those voices when we talk about immigration in this country. Now, I think it's important to recognize my positionality. I'm white. I come from a relatively privileged background. I've been fortunate enough to have my educational credentials recognized here in the United States, which has offered me the opportunity to have the kind of career that I only dreamed of. And in addition to that, I understand that my experiences have been very different from other people's. But I take that as a responsibility to try to speak up for those voices that have not been heard in the United States. So what I would like to do today is have a conversation with you framed by 4 important questions. Why do people come to the United States? What do they face once they arrive here? Why do we talk about immigration as a security threat? And why do we need immigration in the United States? So why do people come to the US? Well, there's a variety of different reasons. Oftentimes, they're escaping extreme poverty, seeking economic opportunities. They may be fleeing political persecution, organized violence, or gender-based violence. Oftentimes, they're also dealing with extortion from gangs and criminal organizations. And many are also seeking to reunite with family members who have already made the journey to the United States. What we're seeing in terms of the migrant populations, though, is a changing demographic. We used to see a lot of people coming from Mexico, but today we're seeing an increase in people coming from Central American countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, fleeing organized crime, gender-based violence, and extortion. We're also seeing people present themselves at the southern border from countries as far-flung as the Middle East, and in China, Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, and Colombia. And they are often fleeing persecution from authoritarian regimes and seeking some relief from poverty. They also have to travel across regions of Latin America that are quite precarious, including the Darien Gap. That is a region between Colombia and Panama that is thick jungle. It has steep mountains. It has a lot of waterways and no infrastructure for roads or pathways. The government of Panama estimated that 52,000 people traversed this region in 2023 alone. And a third of those were children under the age of 5 years old. Many are not able to complete the journeys that they begin and die en route to the United States. The Migration Data Portal also has found that 40,000 people have been reported missing at the US-Mexico border since 2014. So these journeys are very precarious. They are typically journeys that put lives at risk. Even when these migrant groups present themselves through Central America and Mexico, they are often faced with the kinds of risks to their well-being associated with extortion and kidnapping. Smugglers are often using vans and vehicles that are overcrowded, and oftentimes they are in a precarious situation where they're not able to access food, water, and shelter. So what do people face once they arrive? Well, there's a variety of barriers that people face. There are environmental barriers, such as the harsh landscapes of the Arizona deserts, the Rio Grande River, or the kind of physical barriers posed by the US border wall. There are also social barriers, language and communication barriers. People have to typically discuss and present themselves in police headquarters or with Customs and Border Patrol officers. They often have challenges in trying to communicate what they need and advocating for themselves. They typically lack documentation, which is required to provide evidence for asylum and refugee cases. And of course, the pandemic has created a whole other barrier to people's health and their ability to move freely. And there are increasing political barriers here in the United States. In 2019, the United States government imposed the Migrant Protection Protocols, the MPPs. These are also called the Remain in Mexico policy. The US government had a bilateral agreement with Mexico, and they were able to send asylum seekers to Mexico to await their immigration hearings there. They were not allowed to work there. They were often confined to compounds because of risk of gangs, violence, kidnapping, and other kinds of security issues. And they also had to try to get an appointment confirmed on the CPB app. This app, without confirmation, they're not able to present themselves at their immigration court hearings. And of course, as many of you may be aware, there's been a slew of issues related to this app. We also know that under the last Republican administration, we had a family separation policy in place. Over 5,000 children were separated and detained from their parents and guardians at the US border. Many have been returned, but hundreds still remain separated from their families. We did not do an adequate job of tracking where we sent these children and where we sent their family members. We also had to deal with this issue of Title 42. This was the pandemic era protocol that was put in place to reduce asylum seeking during the pandemic. And the Biden administration actually decided to keep that in place till May of 2023. We have seen, as a result of some of these protocols, an increase in deaths and missing people. And both administrations are committed to deportations, to reducing asylum cases, and to securitizing the southern border of the United States. So this is a bipartisan approach. They see it as deterrence for migrants who are presenting at the US border. So why do we talk about immigration as a security threat? In a post-9/11 world, what we have seen is most of the discourse associated with immigration is framed within this national or border security frame. Everything is a threat, and immigration is one of those issues. We see immigration erroneously tied to criminality and, of course, to this risk of terrorism. We also have used derogatory language to define populations who are seeking refuge. We use words like illegal, undocumented, or alien, and this form of language really serves to criminalize, demonize, and dehumanize people. It also renders their humanity invisible to us. We no longer have to care how they're doing, whether they're safe, whether we have any responsibility for their care. We also have seen an increase in the number of people presenting at the southern border as a result of the end of Title 42. And this has created a backlash in the United States, particularly during this election cycle, that has really started to see immigration as a threat. Now, the problem with this kind of discourse is that it's not supported by the data. Okay? So some of the data I wanted to present to you is from the Institute for Policy Research, and they've done some really interesting work. Immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than US-born men. Immigrants are also 30% less likely to be incarcerated than white US men. So criminality is really not something that we can associate with immigration, and there's a lot of research pointing in that direction. The University of Maryland's Profiles of Individual Radicalization dataset also did a really wonderful study looking at internationally inspired terrorism. And they found that most acts of terrorism in the United States are committed by homegrown terrorists, largely US citizens. Of the 3,000 plus acts of terrorism that remained, 0.6% were committed by a person in the US without documentation. So there's still a slight risk, but it's very, very low, and certainly lower than the risk among the US-born population. So why do we need immigration? We need people to work here. We rely on their participation in the workforce. In fact, immigrants participate in the workforce at a rate of 66%. The rate of participation for the US citizen population is only 62%. So we rely on their employment. They serve sectors like transportation, healthcare, construction, textile manufacturing, and a slew of others. We also rely on the tax base that immigrants pay into. Don't be mistaken, they are paying taxes. And those taxes pay into social and public funding that serve all American citizens and residents. We also rely on immigrants to diversify our culture, our ideas, and our understanding of each other and the world. So how do we start to change this conversation? I have a few thoughts on this. I think the first thing that we need to start doing is centering human security. That is, placing people's humanity and their well-being at the core of the policy decisions that we make. We need to be careful how we talk about immigration and immigrants, centering their humanity in our conversations. We need to create immigration policies and agreements that are based on facts, not fears. And that goes across the ideological spectrum. We also need to create and agree upon a comprehensive immigration reform policy. The current one has been in place for over 30 years. And we have not been able to reform our current immigration policy and gain bipartisan support in Congress. We also have to do the job of remembering that people leaving their homes are often doing so because they have to. And we should not be compounding their trauma once they reach our borders. We can be humane in how we process immigration cases at the southern border. We certainly do so at the northern one. We also have an individual responsibility and a community responsibility. We, you, I, we all need to be advocating to our political leaders. Write to your congresspeople, write to your senators, campaign, support nonprofits that are about facts and supporting immigration discourse that is positive and evidence-based. Demand that our political leaders do a better job on immigration. Use your voice and use your vote. Thank you.